defense case is probably 80-20. In a civil case, I am doing mostly plaintiff cases, probably 70-30. It changes all the time.
Have you been allowed to give opinion testimony in the following areas? Human behavior under stress,
Yes.
psychological and physiological responses to stress,
Yes.
use of force decision making.
Yes.
Your Honor, we request permission from this court for Dr. Bedard to give opinion testimony in the fields of educational psychology, specifically use of force decision making and decision making under stressful situations.
Any voir dire or objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Without objection, I'll allow him to testify in the form and opinion in those two fields.
Thank you, Your Honor. If we can start the PowerPoint, Your Honor. Let's start off with broadly. Is there a psychological explanation for how people detect danger during uncertain situations?
Yes.
And what is that? Just a very brief overview before we get into the...
When you have a stimulus in the environment, it's usually presented against what we call a background of noise. Other things are happening, and you're trying to decipher what is in fact happening. And that's known as signal detection theory, the idea that you're looking for the brightest signal in the environment to suggest what may be happening.
Okay. And can you give us an example of what you're speaking of?
I'll speak to the chart that I see up if that's,
Sure.
instead of
Let's
coming
start
up with a
off
separate example. But for example, many of the self-defense cases that I'm involved with are during that predictive period where a person is unsure about what's going to happen in the next moment. And in this case, I've just indicated perhaps somebody believes maybe you have a gun, maybe you don't have a gun. And those are the two absolutes. You either do or you don't. Now, under signal detection theory, as a theoretical framework, what you're looking for in the environment is information that suggests either there is no gun or there is a gun. So this first slide that you're looking at right here, you can see there are two distributions. Those distributions are going to have brighter or less bright signals that are going to accumulate around the mean. That's the center line. So as you see on the left, that's the belief that there's no gun. On the right, there's a belief that there is a gun. So where are the brightest signals? As you start moving away from the mean, you get into what in science we call standard deviations. But the farther away they get, obviously, the less bright the signals are, the less sure you are of something. That's why these are decisions during periods of uncertainty.
Now, I noticed in the top there's lots of time / low consequences.
So what drives the decision making whenever you're making decisions in a naturalistic way, not economically speaking, where you have your stocks on the table and you're trying to decide which is the best one to put your money in, but rather things are unfolding very rapidly. You're going to probably choose the first thing that comes to mind. But as you're trying to assess between is something happening or something not happening, when you have lots of time to do it, you can contemplate. There's a different part of your brain that's actually working, and it's a contemplative part. It's the frontal cortex, really, the executive functioning that we're all equipped with, to be able to contemplate what's going on. And if the consequences are low, likewise. In other words, if you make a poor decision or if you make an error in your decision and the consequences are low, you can usually have less error. Because as you see here, both of these distributions are actually crossing. There is always some error. Even in science, we're happy with a 95% certainty. There's a 5% level of error, for example. So this is showing a very small amount of error when you have low consequences and you have lots of time.
How about when you have lots of time, but there's high consequences?
So consequences create anxiety, and anxiety is the thing that to explain it, I think best when I'm talking to my students, I say anxiety is that healthy respect for the unknown. Like, you don't know what's going to happen. When the consequences are very, very high, anxiety tends to get very high, and anxiety works in a inverted U kind of fashion. You actually perform better with a little anxiety. When you cognitively work better, you physically work better. But at some point when the anxiety gets too high, you plateau and you start coming down the other side. That's that inverted U principle. So when the consequences are high, then the anxiety tends to be very high because you don't know what's going to happen, but you predict oftentimes the worst. So the consequences are a high driving factor when it comes to bringing together the uncertainty. As you can see, these two distributions have moved closer together. They're distinguished by D prime, not that that matters, but that's a smaller line than the one you saw before because the beams are starting to come together. And what you'll notice most importantly is that there's a greater amount of error. And I just want to clarify error. When we talk about error, I'm not talking about conclusion error. I'm not talking about making an error in decision. I'm talking about predictive error. When you don't know what's happening, where will your error bias towards? Will it go more towards a liberal analysis? For example, I don't think there's a gun when there might be, or will it go more towards a conservative analysis? I think there's a gun when there might not be. We don't know for sure, but the error level for prediction increases.
Okay, let's go to the next one. In a situation where you have a short amount of time with low consequences.
Once again, you can see the error has increased, but the consequences have driven the error a little bit lower because even if you make a mistake, the consequences are low. When you have a little amount of time though, I mean the time pressure, we call it, time pressure is on, and you have to make that decision startlingly fast without perhaps having all the information that you would have if you had lots of time.
And the last one, the last graph. You have a short amount of time and high consequences.
Right, so you can see on this chart when you have a short amount of time, in other words, something's happening very, very quickly, it's rapidly unfolding, and the consequences are very high. This is where we see D prime get really small. These two distributions come together, and the bias in this case has to be, once again, either liberal or conservative towards you don't think they have a gun or you do think they have a gun. Now what we see here is the error is significantly higher than it is in all the other circumstances because of the short amount of time and the high consequences. And that just simply means that you may be making the wrong choice, but you feel like you have to make a choice at some level. So what we know about this though is that during these periods there are what are known as type 1 and type 2 errors. So type 1s, I think we often refer to even at the high school level are these false positives that you think something is there that isn't there. And then a type 2 error would be a false negative where you don't think something is there when in fact something is there. And what we know about signal detection theory, certainly when it comes to survival, it always favors type 1. So if the time pressure is low, the consequences are high, then the decision will be towards thinking there's a gun if there's not one, over not thinking there's a gun if there is one for, I think, obvious reasons.
And generally, in the most simplistic way possible, what do these models that you've just explained show in regard to human behavior in certain situations?
Well, in all situations, I think any situation, whether it is considered a critical incident where something is rapidly unfolded and the consequences are very high, or it's just, the decision on, what bill should I pay today because I have only so much money. This chart applies to all different types of decisions in all different domains. It's been used for, gosh, I don't know, probably well over 80 years.
Okay. And what are the two systems of thinking that dominate judgment and decision making in certain situations?
So your brain works differently under different conditions. Most of the time, as you are going through life, you're using System 1. System 1, as you can see here on the chart, is a very automatic, rapid, and efficient system. It was evolutionarily probably designed to get you easily through life with very low energy costs. It's a system that is somewhat non-conscious, and it has a very high capacity for what we call task switching. You can move from thing to thing very rapidly because you're not spending a lot of time thinking about stuff. It's kind of like driving to work, for example. Very few of us are contemplating every left turn and every blinker. We're just doing it kind of automatically. That's how our brain's functioning. It also is called upon during critical periods. And the reason that happens is because System 2, which I'll talk about now, which is the other part of your brain, a very, very controlled, very analytical, very deliberate type of thinking, is usually called upon by System 1 when there seems to be some sort of a cognitive crisis, like System 1 can't figure it out. Turns out System 2 is pretty lazy. It's usually sleeping. We don't like using it. It's high energy cost, which is why it usually is operating in the background and not out front. But interestingly, during high pressure situations, when you have somebody, for example, who's facing a very high consequence, there are neurons that are actually projecting from the limbic system, which is the emotional part of your brain, into that prefrontal cortex that attenuate the prefrontal cortex, almost turning it off. It just goes dark. And the reason for that is because System 2 is not necessary in the next moment. It's too contemplative. It takes too long to figure things out. So the example I always give is if you see, for example, I don't know, our ancestors walking across the Serengeti would see a saber-toothed tiger. The question is not, I wonder if he's hungry. That is a system 2 question. It's contemplative. There's a lot of wonder there. What happens is system 2 turns off and system 1 takes over, and it only thinks in what are known as heuristics. These are these snap decisions. Run, jump, hide, swim, whatever's available to you. So system 1 is in charge during critical incidents. It's not something that we plan for. It's just the way our evolution has designed us to keep us safe and to keep us alive.
And so many times in stressful situations, commonly people like ourselves think about the fight or flight situation. Will you speak to the jury about that?
Sure. Fight or flight situation, once again, is not something we plan for. It's not something you contemplate. It just sort of happens. So in your brain resides this little area here. It's sort of an almond-shaped group of nerves and cells called the amygdala. And the amygdala is on constant watch. It's looking for danger from crossing the street or perhaps from walking in a dark alley, whatever the case may be. When the amygdala senses danger or potential danger, it starts alerting different parts of your brain. And if you look at the chart up here, you can see the hypothalamus out there, which is just sort of like governing everything. It's notified by the amygdala that there may be danger present. And what it does is it starts through chemical processes secreting hormones. These are called catecholamines, these stress hormones. The hypothalamus is then going to affect the pituitary gland, which you can see right there, sort of under the nose. The pituitary gland is responsible for producing more stress hormones. One of them is called ACTH, which then travels down through the bloodstream to a word probably you have heard, which is the adrenal glands. You've probably all heard of adrenaline. Adrenal glands secrete the chemicals that mobilize us for fight or flight, for running or perhaps for fighting, depending on what the circumstances are. And this would include epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol primarily.
How about during a life or death situation?
So during a life or death situation, those are the adrenal glands, by the way, just to make you aware that not all this is happening in the brain. The adrenal glands actually sit on top of the kidneys. So there's an entire holistic body response to fear, to danger. I'm sorry, I lost your question as I got to that slide.
No, during a life or death situation.
Okay, so during a life or death situation, that's primarily where this happens. Sometimes you end up getting secretions of cortisol in your system. I think a lot of people are aware of that. If you're into fitness, you know cortisol makes you fat if you don't get it out. But you know, you can sit at your desk and have these sort of fight-flight reactions from perhaps something you're thinking about at home or perhaps something that's happened with your kid. You have a sort of a fight-flight response. It's a thing that wakes you up from a deep sleep. So during a life or death situation, which is what our system is designed, this HPA axis is designed to really deal with, can occur at different times, but it's most acute during actual threats. Car crashes, other critical incidents like that, where you feel that cold chill down your body. That is the catecholamines secreting into your system.
Okay, let's go to the next one. What is this, doctor?
So that is the inverted U. That is the arousal scale when you get aroused, and there's certainly many different ways of getting aroused, but we're talking about more of an anxiety arousal, something that you're facing when you're not exactly sure what's going to happen. So on the left side, you can see it says comfort, and on the right side, it's anxiety. Now, the importance of this, I think, in any type of self-defense sort of perspective, is that when you're talking about the rise in comfort, it comes from an appraisal of the situation. So anxiety is caused by not necessarily the threat, but how you appraise the threat. And that's based on what you think your coping mechanisms are. And this is where we get into things like self-efficacy. If you have the coping mechanisms to deal with it, you tend to stay on the left side of the medium. You tend to stay more comfortable. That's known as a challenge, right? So sports are essentially in the world of challenge. They're in the world of being comfortable. And so we see really good performance when you see anxiety starting to go up. But at some point, if your coping mechanisms can no longer deal with the challenge, it's no longer a challenge, it becomes what's called a threat. And when it becomes a threat, anxiety is now not such a positive force. It starts to degrade performance. It degrades not only physical performance, but also psychological, cognitive performance as well. So this is a curve, once again, been around a long, long time, that has to do primarily with arousal and performance and how they interact during changing situations.
And what are the chemical reactions on the body and mind
As far as,
in regard to this line?
so there are changes, and quite interesting changes, and there's a whole bunch of them. I mean, it's known as an allostatic load. When the cognitive load becomes too much, your body gets out of balance. And this happens because of some other processes. Your sympathetic nervous system, which is part of your central nervous system, becomes active, and it sort of attenuates the parasympathetic nervous system. And in doing that, it's causing these organ processes to work that are leaking chemicals into your body and changing really the way that you see things, the way that you hear things. It has a profound effect on memory. One of the things that we're reasonably sure of is that dangerous situations imprint differently than most calm situations. And there's a reason for that as well. You want them to be more available to you, providing you come across another dangerous situation that looks similar to the one that you faced before. So these imprints of memory become somewhat fragmented because they don't follow the normal circuits, if you will, of lying down memory in the brain. But you also get some weird things that are oftentimes detected in case studies and also empirical studies. You get, for example, tunnel vision. Your eye actually physically changes. It'll tend to elongate, for example, even if you're nearsighted. It does that because we generally, through evolution, think that threats come from the outside in. So your eye's trying to identify things at a distance. So as your eye elongates, you'll actually become tunnel vision. You'll see things very acutely that are dangerous, and everything else you don't see at all. And it is described as looking through a tunnel. For example, looking through a paper towel holder, if you can imagine that. That's kind of what it's like under very, very high arousal. I have had a police officer one time say that it was like looking through a soda straw when the arousal got high.
Sustained.
So given different circumstances, it doesn't happen in all cases, but you will experience some perceptual distortions. Some things will seem slower than they normally are. Some things will seem faster than they normally are. Some things will see farther away than they normally are, or closer than they normally are. Those are often reported as a consequence of these chemical reactions to the body and mind.
In regard to decision-making under stressful situations, does the fact that someone is significantly older than the individual that they are having a confrontation with, does that affect the individual's decision-making process?
It could. I mean, I don't think, again, it's a answer that I can say across the board, but age certainly matters. I think most people understand there are things they could do when they were younger that they wouldn't even attempt to do now. And this goes to the point of self-efficacy. This is a self-evaluation. Am I prepared to take on this task? If you're older than a person, for example, you may be confronting, you may choose avoidance over engagement because your self-efficacy tells you this is not something you're going to prevail in.
How about if you're weaker than that individual?
Same thing. Another issue of, or the perception of weakness, I should say, because of course we don't ever know how strong they are. We only know how strong we are. So if there's a perception of weakness on your part that you feel like, I just can't take this person, right? Then what will once again happen is you'll practice avoidance over engagement because your self-efficacy is low.
How about if, in the decision-making process under stressful situations, if you are an individual who has a lot of medical issues, a lot of medical infirmities, does that affect your decision-making process
Again,
under those stressful situations?
And that is the nature of self-efficacy, is it's always changing, and it can happen in an instant, for example. It doesn't even have to be a long-term medical issue. For example, let's say you're in a fight and you suddenly get thrown to the ground and you shatter your kneecap. You're not the same person you were just a moment ago. You have a medical issue. So your self-efficacy will choose a different path. It won't continue to engage, for example. It may start to just drop to the ground and cover up, or you may try to crawl away or something like that. So your defensive strategy will change according to your medical condition.
How about if you have had prior negative dealings with the individual that you're having a confrontation with?
That's very important because through something called predictive coding, we're constantly updating the world. And there's an old saying that the best way to predict the future is by knowing the past. And there's some truth to that. It's not entirely true because most things are random. But the belief system that something you've seen before will occur again goes to the nature of us being pattern-seeking creatures. We're always looking for patterns and things. So when we see something, especially emotional, that imprints itself on our memory, it stays with us for a very, very long time. example of a burning car when you're traveling down the road, if you've ever seen a burning car on the side of the road. This is the part of the road where cars burn. That's what you'll be thinking. And it will take you going perhaps hundreds of times down that road to get rid of that memory. That's how salient it becomes.
In regard to use of force analysis and decision-making process, in addition to fear, does anger ever become a factor?
It does. Most of the time, I think it commingles with fear. Oftentimes, fear is not a great motivator for survival. Dropping to the ground and crawling into a ball is not usually keeping you alive. Oftentimes, this idea that it has to be one or the other is just simply not true. The cascade of emotions that occur when you're in danger can be multiple. And I will tell you that one of the greatest motivators for survival is anger, along with fear.
In regard to the decision-making process under stressful situations, does time ever feel longer than it actually is?
It does, and that goes to the perceptual distortions I talked about. There could be a situation that happens in a second, and it may seem, or a millisecond, and it may seem like it's taken a minute. But I should also say that to some people it can seem slower. There are cases where individuals have described things as moving in slow motion, for example. So it's all depending on the individual.
In regard to the decision-making process under stressful situations, do individuals after the fact have problems remembering certain parts of the event that caused the stressful situation?
It happens all the time that we are not able to consolidate memories in the immediate aftermath of an event. So it often takes time. For example, it might take 12, 48, 72 hours for memories to consolidate. We think it happens during rest, during sleep. So it's quite common if you're trying to answer questions or have recall about an event that was a high arousal event, immediately after it, that your answers will be junk answers, because oftentimes you don't have memories and you're just trying to fill in the blanks.
In regard to the decision-making process under stressful situations, do individuals after the fact tend to either not be emotional or be very emotional?
Again,
regarding the event?
It's a cascade. I mean, you have polarization. Sometimes it's quite unusual when somebody is involved in a very dangerous and tragic event. The emotion they're giving you is exhilaration. And that's kind of strange, and I think it's alarming to the contemplative mind. But we think the reason that happens is because if you just survived an encounter, for example, every cell in your body is celebrating, right? So you're alive, you made it through, and so this has an emotional response that can be exhilaration. And then there are other times a person may feel deep depression. I mean, they have more of an understanding of what has happened, and perhaps are now moving towards system 2. The parasympathetic nervous system is starting to take over, and you're starting to have a contemplative recollection of events, and that can move you into depression. So there's no right way to act after a situation has occurred. It varies.
If I may have a moment, Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
Are all of the opinions that you have shared with the court and jury today within a reasonable degree of scientific and use of force analysis certainty?
They are.
Thank you. No further questions. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, sir. Do you want this slide up or no?
Yes. Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
You are not a licensed psychologist, correct?
I am not.
Nor are you a licensed psychiatrist?
No.
Not a medical doctor?
No.
And you've never counseled or treated patients in a psychological or psychiatric setting?
I have not.
The majority of your life has been involved in law enforcement.
Yes.
And you've actually developed some unique products that law enforcement officers use in their everyday duties, right?
I have, yes.
Your master's degree is in educational psychology, right?
It is, yes.
And you received that degree, I believe, in 2014.
Yes,
That degree came from the Department of Education, not the Department of Psychology, correct?
that's right.
And you basically went back to school to try to get a better understanding of how to better train law enforcement officers, right?
Well, to train everyone, I think. At that point, I was already, as I told you, I started as a self-defense instructor. But to understand what happened, why people behave the way they do under stress, that was my big question, why I went back to school.
Would you agree that people have to make split-second decisions every day?
I suppose some people do. I don't know if everyone does.
For instance, I'll give you an example that probably everybody in this room has experienced at some point. I'm driving down the road, and the car ahead of me slams on its brakes, and I then have a split-second decision to make.
Yes.
Okay, I have to decide, do I have enough time to hit my brakes to avoid making contact with the car ahead of me?
You generally won't make that decision. That'll be an automatic response.
Okay. Would I also have to, well, depending on how much time I have, right?
How much time you have, that's right. If it's way down the road, then yes, you can contemplate it. But if they slam on their brakes so that it has a meaningful effect, oftentimes the automaticity of your actions will take over. That system one we talked about, it will engage. You won't be working off system two.
And that system's going to help me decide, do I hit my brakes to try to avoid? Do I swerve right? Do I swerve left into the oncoming traffic? Or if I have nowhere to go, I just got to hit the brakes and try to minimize the damage.
If you have the time to do it, yes.
Okay. And the brain makes all of those decisions in a split second, does it not?
Well, not if you're contemplating. If you're contemplating, it could be the course of several seconds, and depending on how much time. I mean, if you're a radar operator with something coming in, it could be several minutes, could be an hour. So the process, once again, varies given the context of the danger, I suppose.
And the immediacy of the danger.
The immediacy of the danger will be a system one response.
That situation I just described could be considered a very stressful situation, could it not?
Sure.
It could create a high anxiety.
Yes.
If you make the wrong decision, you could be seriously injured or seriously injure somebody else.
I would think so.
And people are put in those positions every day, are they not?
Again, yes, I don't know what people you mean. I think the context matters. If you stay home all day reading books, I don't know how many
Sure.
opportunities you have to be placed in high stressful situations. But it is quite common that individuals are forced to make some type of split decision on a daily basis.
Now, obviously, the more time that I have between seeing this immediate threat ahead of me, this car slamming on its brakes, the better ability I have to react.
I would say yes.
And the better ability I have to make a more reasoned and informed decision.
Yes.
If I have 50 feet or 5 seconds to react to this car slamming its brakes on ahead of me, I have a better ability to react than I have if I have an immediate threat and I have 10 feet and a half a second to react.
Well, it depends on, I would say that's true, but it depends on the speed you're traveling as well,
Sure.
of course.
Is that similar to the concept of the signal detection theory that you described earlier?
Kind of. So you're talking about almost an economic model of decision making, like I can swerve or I can hit my brakes or I can go off to the curb. Those are picking the best answer between multiple versions of response that you have time to contemplate. Signal detection theory does offer that, but remember that the whole point is uncertainty. In other words, you don't have an answer on what to do. You're not really certain about what to do. So in the backdrop of uncertainty, or when you're trying to decide something is, you're not looking at brake lights coming on. You're trying to decide something unknown. It's a different experience, because what you're having to do is make decisions based on what you don't know, not based on what you do know. You're answering, or to answer your question, knowing that the brake lights come on is something you know.
But you don't know what is going to happen if I choose to swerve right or left or hit the brake. Do I have enough movement?
Well, I think you calculate what will happen, and I think that's fair. But again, the signal detection theory is based on uncertainty. I just don't know what I'm looking at or looking for. I'm leaning in one direction or the other, and this is why the SDTL, we'll call it shortly, is based on what we call liberal and conservative bias, because there's that error component in the prediction level.
When you mentioned, touched on this earlier, that in a situation where there is stress or anxiety, there's an adrenal response.
Yes.
Okay. And basically adrenaline kicks in and it floods the body and the brain.
Yes.
Okay. It makes your lungs work more efficiently.
Yes.
It causes blood vessels to send more blood to your muscles.
There's blood shifts around the bodies based on where it's needed, but it may go to your muscles, some may go to the viscera. And this is done through the changes in blood vessels and capillaries.
And that's why we see some people do like amazing feats of strength in those situations.
Yes.
It also sends more blood to your brain,
Yes.
and that causes the brain to become more alert and focused, does it not?
Oftentimes, yes.
It is that rush of adrenaline that helps the brain make that split-second decision to know what to do when that car ahead of you slams its brakes on.
I'm sorry, repeat your question.
It's that rush of adrenaline that causes my brain to be able to make that split-second decision to react to the car ahead of me.
Right, if it's a high arousal, then it's going to be automatized. So system 1 will engage, and it will be because of the physiological and psychological changes that you're undergoing.
So often I do that without even thinking about it.
Well, it's automatized, you never think about it. That's the description of system 1.
Would you agree, take my situation, if I am an experienced driver, been driving for 30 years of my life, I am better equipped to assess this car ahead of me, assess the immediate threat in front of me, and make a good decision.
Yes, that's true.
I'm better equipped in that position than I am if I was a 15-year-old driver who has driven twice in my life and didn't know what to do.
Most certainly.
So your age, your life experiences factor into your ability to make a good decision.
Well, depending on whether it's a novel event or not, right? I mean, so there are some things that you've never seen before. It doesn't matter if you're 15 or 50. So, for example, if no one's ever pulled a gun on you, you may not know what to do. There's no blueprint for that. So your novel decision-making is just as green as a 15-year-old who has also never had a gun pulled on him. But to your driving example, once again, the assumption is if you're 50 and driving, you've probably braked a lot. You've probably had these situations occur all the time. And if you're 15, you haven't. So in that case, these are not novel situations. These are repeat situations that you formulated a plan for, and they become automatized over time.
Even people with general life experiences have experienced different forms of stress, different forms of anxiety, different forms of threats, right?
I'm not sure what you're asking me exactly. Different forms, they appraise them differently. So again, it's not necessarily what the threat is, it's how you appraise it, right? So if you and I are standing next to each other and I got a gun and you don't, and I get attacked by a bear, I'm in a better position to make a decision to engage than you are, because I have the coping mechanism for that situation. So my appraisal might be that this bear is a challenge. Yours is no, it's a threat. You're up a tree, I'm standing here shooting at the bear. So given the same stimulus, that can be appraised very, very differently. And that is precisely what we do. We are constantly calculating our ability to manage a stimulus. And if we can manage it, once again, it is considered just a challenge. But if we can't manage it, it becomes a threat. And this is where arousal starts to see a drop-off in performance.
And would you agree that general life experiences gives an older person a better ability to manage situations? Because they've seen situations differently and more often in a different context than a 15-year-old.
It's probably an empirical question. I don't know if that's been tested. I mean, there's this thing called near and far transfer. So if you do things similar to something else, you have what are called near transfers. If you do things that are way different, then you have far transfers. How those things affect novel situations, I'm not exactly sure.
You also mentioned something in your direct examination that when talking about maybe prior difficulties with somebody that future behavior is
Future behavior is predicted on past behavior, yeah.
okay.
And again, it may not be exactly predicted because it's random, right? So one event doesn't necessarily have any relation to the other one, but our perception of past events is what directs our decision-making in future events.
You charge $300 an hour, correct?
Yes.
And about how many hours have you devoted to this case so far?
I don't know, probably 15, 17.
Can I have one moment, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
You to redirect?
Yes, sir, thank you. Since Mr. Buffin asked you, tell us, what is educational psychology exactly? Oh, you're good.
So when I went back to school, I already had a whole career behind me as a law enforcement officer, and my interest in further study going to graduate school was to learn about how stress affected individuals, because what we were seeing in the field is that people weren't performing the way we were teaching them to perform. I thought at first perhaps I would find the answer in military studies or something like that, but as I did further investigation, what I found out is this idea of anxiety and stress is most profound in sport psychology, sport exercise and performance. Why is that? Because we don't have people in lab coats standing on the battlefield. We don't have people in lab coats standing, in the neighborhoods when the police show up. But we do have people with lab coats in the laboratory working with athletes. We have them on the gridiron. We have them on the diamond. And they are seeing how people perform when they get very high levels of stress. We just had the Olympics, great example. You see people, we call it choking under stress. And so all of that data is found in educational psychology, not clinical psychology. I wasn't interested in working with people who were unwell, people who had disorders. I was interested in working with hire out this type of arousal, because you can't shoot at people and see what they do. But we do have a lot of information from the field, from law enforcement, from the military about those things. And so it's sort of a separate category from the everyday events that you see, like driving your car. That's not the kind of arousal. You don't get as aroused as, for example, somebody sticking a gun in your face and threatening to kill you. So they're viewed slightly differently than everyday events. The idea that you have to make split decisions, can be whether or not you decide to send
experiences that an individual has, right?
Yes.
And statistically, do a lot of people have experience in a use of force analysis?
Analysis, no, or do you mean the use of force situation?
I'm sorry, use of force situation.
They really don't. I mean, considering the number of the amount of violence that we have in this country, I think is well known. But we have a lot of people in this country too. So the statistics have a breakdown to very, very few people having any experience with violence, and even fewer with deadly violence.
Okay. If I may have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
No further questions. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Any additional questions?
Can I have one more, Your Honor?
Sure.
No questions, Your Honor.
You excused?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Have a nice day, sir.
Your Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, I'll let you know where we're going from here, okay? Thank you. All right, the jury is out of the courtroom. Are there any other additional witness for the defense?
No, sir.
All right. Ms. Lawrence, have you discussed with your attorneys the decision regarding whether or not you will testify or not?
Yes, I have.
Do you need any additional time to discuss that decision with them?
No,
Have they forced you to make a decision in any way?
no,
Have you made a decision on your own?
Yes, I have.
Can you tell us what that decision is?
I am not going to testify.
You've made that decision freely and voluntarily?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to bring the jurors back in, and then you want to rest with the jurors?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So what I'll do is, it's 1:30 now. I'm going to tell them that, given the schedule and the length of closing arguments that everyone has suggested there may be, that it would be too late to send them out this afternoon, because honestly, they'd be going out conservatively at 4:30, maybe later. And I don't want to put any sort of pressure on them to make a decision fast or slow. So what we'll do is I'll let them go for the afternoon, and then we'll start tomorrow morning. You've told me you think a couple hours for yours?
Judge, I'm going to try my best to maybe get it to an hour and a half.
I'm not going to limit anybody, because of the nature of the case, there's no reason to limit anybody. I always caution people, going too long can sometimes be detrimental. Going too short can be detrimental, so please just try to govern yourselves accordingly.
Yes, sir.
If you need the boards, let me know ahead of time, and I'll be happy to turn them on for you.
I will
Any
need it.
evidence you need, make sure you have that available to you.
Yes, sir.
If there's anything else you need, please let me know. So I'll bring them back in, and then I'll let them go for the evening, and we'll have them here. What time do you guys want to start tomorrow morning?
9 a.m. is fine.
Okay. I mean, like I said, I'm on duty, so I have a few things to do in the morning before I come in court, and I do stuff during lunch. But luckily, duty ends at noon for me tomorrow. So, a week of being on call. Nevertheless, I'll just inform them of the schedule. That means they'll probably be going into deliberation sometime around lunch. I'll give them plenty of time to make a decision. And I'll let them know that, hey, while you're deliberating, no one can contact you. But also let them know that they can take as long as they want in deliberations. It's up to them completely. All right? So that's the only instructions I'll give them. But you want to rest before that, right? You want to rest now?
Yes.
Okay. Bring him back.
Not sure if the court mentioned it this morning, but for the record, Ms. Lorincz is uncuffed, wearing the same type of civilian clothing that she has.
Yeah, she's been in civilian clothing the entire trial.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You don't have any hands cuffs or leg cuffs on? Okay, thank you.
I'm just freezing. That's right.
You cold?
I'm freezing.
All right. We always try to keep it a little cool. You'd be surprised how hot it is to try a case. So it's always better to be cool.
You don't have to feel too bad. I've got both of the sweaters.
Okay. Ms. Sizemore,
Yes, Judge. The defense rests.
I take it there's no rebuttal.
No rebuttal, Your Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, both the state and the defense have now rested their cases. So what we're going to do is go into a recess until tomorrow afternoon. The reason we're going to a recess now is because of the time that it may take for the parties to present their closing arguments, and for me to give you the instructions means you wouldn't be getting this case till very, very late in the afternoon. I don't want to put any pressure on you regarding how long you need to deliberate. When you deliberate the case, you'll have as long as you want, but I don't want to start at 5:00 p.m. Okay, so you should have it probably around lunchtime tomorrow, somewhere in that range. Okay. of course, even tomorrow, you can deliberate for as long as you want. We're just going to be starting a lot earlier for your convenience. I want to remind you that the case is not over, so you can't begin to deliberate at any point now. You still have to have the closing arguments and the instructions on the law. Once you hear all of that, you go back for the final time. You'll take your notebooks with you, and then you can begin to deliberate the case. You're still under the rule. Please don't let anyone say anything to you about this case. Please don't look up anything about this case. Please don't talk about this case at all. If when you come in the morning, I'm going to give you each a number for you as a juror. So if any time during your deliberations you need to ask any sort of questions or anything else, you'll be identified by your number. Okay, it's going to be just like school. I'm going to hand you a piece of paper with your name and a number on it. And then you'll do everything by, say, juror number 2, what have you. But if you need an emergency number tomorrow morning in case you can't go 3 hours without a phone, or however long it may take, I don't want to say 3 hours, but however long it may take for delivery, please let us know and we'll provide a number to you. Okay? With that, you're excused for the day. Have a very nice day. Thank you. Leave your notebooks here, please. We will give you lunch as well tomorrow. Does anyone else have anything they need to address before we recess for today?
There was just one small error that I found in jury instructions, and I think we need to address a couple of things in it.
Okay. As I normally do, I will, once we finalize these, I'll explain to the jurors that I'll make a copy of the instructions for each of the jurors for them to have when they deliberate. As probably all of you are familiar with my practices, there'll be one set for the foreperson, and there's one verdict form, and then each of the other jurors has a set to help them discuss instructions while they deliberate. What is the error?
If you go to the excusable homicide in the very last paragraph, where it says, "I now instruct you on the circumstances that must be proved before Susan Lorincz may be found guilty of manslaughter," and it has "or any lesser included crime."
So I'll take out "or any lesser included crime."
Hold on a second. Where is that?
Under excusable homicide.
It's page 5, Judge.
There's no numbers.
Yeah.
Just count down 5 pages. Okay. Oh, on the introduction of homicide one?
Yeah, if you go to the
Okay,
last paragraph.
I now instruct in the circumstances must be proved before Susan Lorincz may be found guilty of manslaughter. You want a period after manslaughter.
Right, because there are no lesser included, and I don't want them to get confused.
No, I appreciate that. Did you read it out loud and find that, or?
I did.
See? What's that?
And then there's the little paragraph in italics. The defendant in this case has become a witness. You should apply the same rules. I think we need to take that out.
Right.
Taking that out.
And that is under
3.8
3.9.
3.9.
or 3.9.
That'll be taken out, and we'll keep in 3.9A. Yes, ma'am?
Yes, sir.
What else?
That was it.
Okay. So, what we'll do, Mr. Smith, whoever sent me this copy, I think that was you, correct?
Yes, sir.
Send a copy to Ms. Sizemore, if that's who's getting it, whoever on the defense is getting it. And then once you guys tell me everyone's good on this, then I'll have Ms. Matthews make the copies.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay? And I appreciate it. Take these back. be it for today. Thank you, everybody. Have a
Thank
nice
you,
day.
Judge.
Thank you, Your Honor.